Welcome, girls. How are you all? So, today, let us start with Indian economics. So, we are going to continue with chapter 4, poverty. So, in the previous class, we had studied the introduction part of poverty. We had understood the concept what do you mean by poverty, and who are poor, how to identify poor. So when we studied the various concepts about poverty in the previous class, we also learned how poverty is being affected and due to which the population level, the standard of living of people, how it is deteriorating. So now we shall be understanding. Moving on to the next slide, we'll be understanding about various categories or types of poverty. When we talk about types, so there are many ways to categorize poverty. So amongst them, the first thing is chronic poverty. Okay, we will study what do you mean by chronic poverty in the next slide. The next is transient poverty or transient poor. You can say chronic poor, transient poor, then non-poor. So we shall understand what is chronic poor. People who are usually poor and always poor are primarily known as chronic poor. So these people they can never they can never improve their standard of living. They're not so rich or they don't have that much of money where they can afford for their day to day expenses. They cannot even spend on their food. The income, it's like heights, they can't even earn the minimum income rate. So the level is totally low. They cannot afford anything. All right. So under chronic poor, there is one more thing that you can also learn is about churning poor. People who regularly move in and out of poverty are called as churning poor. So they either sometimes the circulation of money will be in such a way for these kind of people that sometimes they might earn income, sometimes they may not. So there is possibility for them to keep moving in and out of poverty. They might have money and they might not have money. They might be able to afford to their expenses, sometimes they may not be able to, but the standard of living of chronic poor or the churning poor remains the same. So you can look at the picture over here, how the chronic poor lead their life. All right. So moving on to the next slide, it is about transient poor. What do you mean by transient poor? People who are rich most of the time but may sometimes have a patch of bad luck. Okay, they are called the transient poor or occasionally poor. So girls, here you need to understand this is sometimes like a mere luck. For example, now the situation of our world, what's happening everywhere, it is like no one can even expect that this is going to happen. Did you even think that you're going to do your PUC like this? Did you even expect that you will be having a phone in front of you and listening to your teacher? So this is never expected. All these are unexpected uncertainties. Likewise, there are so many expenses that suddenly come, and there are so many losses that come in so many forms that you never expect how you're going to get bankrupt, isn't it? Transient poor are one such kind of people where you can see during this COVID situation, there are some business who which do not have any value at all. Swiggy, I can give you an example of this business. Initial days of COVID, nobody were ordering from Swiggy. It was a total zero profit for all the restaurant hotel industry. You agree with me? So it's like a mere bad luck for them. And also you can see during the construction of metro or any flyover, okay, there are shops which is located below the flyover or which would come below the flyover. Have you seen, after once the flyover flourishes, those shops, they started to decline because nobody even spotted there is some shop like this. So these are the conditions what happens to the transient poor. Sorry for the sore throat. Next is the non-poor. Okay. Non-poor are the people who are never poor and they are non-poor. So they tend to have money all the time. There's no time where they even feel they need something to be dependent, to be relied on. So that it's very easy for them. They're never poor and they've never even felt what a poor person would feel or the pinch of the need or want for something. It's because they have ample amount of money and they can spend. So that is about non-poor. So now going back, we have studied about three types of poverty, categories of poverty. Firstly, chronic poor, under which you also saw what is that churning poor. Also, girls, you need to keep in mind under chronic poor, you have seen the churning poor, right? Likewise, the transient poor, who are also called as occasionally poor. Okay, don't get confused when they ask what do you mean by chronic poor, or churning poor, occasionally poor or transient poor, and then never poor or non poor. So with this, if in case if there is a question what do you mean by churning poor, do not get confused, it is chronic poor. What do you mean by occasionally poor? It is nothing but the transient poor. What do you mean by non-poor? They are never poor. So these are the different names given and they might twist and they might ask you a question for which you should be able to answer. I have explained you various names given for these categories. Alright. Moving on to the next slide. We'll be learning more about the concept of poverty line. Now, in the previous class, we have learned what do you mean by poverty, isn't it? So, what is poverty? You all know. And who are poor, you know. How to identify poor, you all know. Now, poverty line. What is poverty line? Poverty line is a cutoff point on the line of distribution which usually divides the population of the country as poor and non-poor. So, it is a line, okay, where a cutoff point is there on the distribution which usually divides the population into poor and non-poor. The people below the poverty line are called as poor. Who are above the poverty line are called as non-poor. It is simple. Understood? So please understand here in the next 2 points it tells you who are poor with the consideration of poverty line. Okay? People with income below the poverty line are called as poor. Alright? People with income above the poverty line are called as non-poor. Okay, girls? Did you understand? Please just have a look. I'm sorry, I just forgot to scroll down. Okay, with this, we shall move on to the next slide. The poverty line. Poverty line is the level of income to meet the minimum living conditions. So, every individual will be earning certain amount of income. So there should be a minimum earnings of every individual so that he could meet his day-to-day living conditions, isn't it? If he does not earn the minimum amount to meet his daily needs, say food, shelter or clothing, then what is he called as? He's called as a poor, right? Can poor afford 3 meals a day? Can poor afford a proper shelter? Can poor afford a good clothing? So, all this comprises the standard of living of a person being a poor and non poor. Understood? With the next point, poverty line is the amount of money needed for a person to meet his basic needs. So, as I told you, there should be a minimum amount every month or weekly for you to meet the basic needs. It is defined as the money value of the goods and services needed to provide basic welfare to an individual. It is a simple concept where you can understand what do you mean by poverty line. Okay. With this slide, I will understand that you all understood what do you mean by poverty line. Poverty line is something which describes the income of a particular person and whether that person is able to meet his basic needs. That describes the poverty line. Alright, you can just have a look at this picture. This is about India's poverty profile. How many number of people are poor, and it also says among 5 Indians there's one poor. So imagine amongst that much of population how many poor will be there. So there are 62% of poor in India. So this is the condition of our country. Okay girls, let's move to the next slide. How do you determine the poverty line? There should be a measure, isn't it? How do you measure a bag of potatoes? Using weight. What kind of weight? Either could be grams or kilograms, isn't it? Likewise, poverty. Okay? Poverty also could be measured in terms of what? With what? What is a measure that our government introduced? In India, monthly per capita expenditure or MPCE method is used to determine poverty line. So this is the abbreviation of MPCE. MPCE means M stands for monthly, P stands for per, C stands for capita, E stands for expenditure. So MPCE method is the measure that is to determine poverty line. Now, how is this helping to determine the poverty? Firstly, minimum calorie intake. How is it MPCE going to help is, it is first going to determine the minimum intake of calories of people residing in rural areas and urban areas. So there are 2400 calories per person per day for rural areas and 2100 calories per person per day for urban areas. This is the minimum amount of calorie intake. Now we shall see with this minimum amount what is the cost of these amount of calories that is being consumed. So minimum monthly per capita consumption expenditure in 2011 to 2012 was worked out to be rupees 816 per person in rural areas and rupees 1000 per person in urban areas. Understood? So you can differentiate now what's the money value is also high and low here compared to the urban and the rural areas. Next is poverty line divides the poor from non-poor. It's obvious, isn't it girls? So this poverty line, it's like a bridge between poor and non-poor. So if you are poor, you go across the bridge, or below the bridge. You go below the bridge. If you are non-poor, you will go above the bridge. So this line is dividing who's poor. Below the line is poor. Above the line is non-poor. Okay. So government just introduced this poverty line, MPC measures and everything. What did this help our country? In what way our economy was benefited? Did the poverty reduce? Did the number of people becoming poor, did it stop? No, it did not. So let us see now what were the criticisms of poverty line. So the monthly per capita expenditure method of determining poverty line is criticized due to the following reasons. The measure that was introduced by the government, which is called as MPCE, nothing but monthly per capita expenditure, had certain critics started to criticize this kind of measure or method with the following reasons. What were the reasons? It doesn't differentiate between very poor and the other poor. Now, girls, you know who are very poor. In the previous class, I've told you. Very poor are those category of people who do not even afford to have one meal a day. They do not have any shelter. They are very poor. Other poor are at least they have one or two meals a day and one small hut to live. So they are called as poor. So with this, you need to understand just poor is not a critical issue. Being very poor is a critical matter that has to, reach the people of our country. They need to understand what is the situation, what is the criteria that they have to take up different measures to fight this poverty. Okay, the next point, what they felt poverty line is not doing or MPC method is not working is difficult to identify the poor who need help the most. First thing, they are not able to find out the difference between very poor and poor. Now, how are they going to identify the poor who need help? How do they even know where they're situated? So all these things mattered, and it became a big, it started to decline. The MPC method, it did not help, it did not support the poverty to subside. It even, it was just a waste of time. The next factor that was influencing that um, brought did not help the poverty line is factors other than income and assets associated with poverty, like accessibility to education, healthcare, etc., have been ignored. So this MPCE method, they were just focusing who is having how much of property, how much of money, what is the income. So they were just looking at the basic thing, what is visible, assets. Do they have two-wheeler? Do they have one house to live? They how many meals do they eat? They were just focusing at this concept, but they never understood how many members lived in that particular family who are poor or very poor. Are they educated? Do we need to help them in this particular field? Do we need to get them a proper health care? Do we need to help them get a good job opportunities? Nothing. This sector was totally ignored. So this became a big issue with the method, MPCE method. So that's why the method did not succeed. So the next point, what did hindrance to this kind of method is doesn't consider social factors that are responsible for poverty, like illiteracy, ill health, etc. So illiteracy, as I told you, literate is nothing but a person who is educated. Illiteracy is one who is uneducated. Ill health, the previous point is this same as the last point, and this all affected the employment. So if one is not employed, then he will not be able to earn proper income. If he does not earn income, what happens? This is a chain cycle. So he is not going to have money to spend. When he doesn't have any money to spend, then he will be called as a poor. Okay. So next, what is the change in the poverty line? According to government, higher economic growth rate, increased agriculture production and economic reforms of 1991 resulted in decline in poverty levels. As we have studied in the previous three chapters about how India was under the hands of colonial rule, how India struggled to come out of the strings of the British emperor, how the Indians were exploited with all the raw materials, with all the labor treatment. So you need to understand, though the government did lot of ways of reforms were introduced, the agriculture were developed, there were various agricultural reforms which was introduced, the green revolution, then land sealing, none of it gave a light on this poverty. Poverty was a stagnant sector where it did not subside, it just grew more and more, with irrespective of all the reforms, irrespective of all the focus on the agricultural production. There were no help given for this particular set of people to improve in their standard of living. Also, one very important thing what I would like to mention is, during the British rule, except agriculture, there were no other occupation done by our Indians. So, with this, you can see how the British rule uh, subsided, or put us down, snubbed us to just keep us in limits. Our work was only agriculture. There was nothing that we were supposed to be developed. There were nothing that we could improve in. So they just shut the doors of all other services or industrial sectors. They just kept only agriculture open because we had ample amount of land, and the farming was our culture. With this, the only occupation or only income that our country earned was through agriculture. The most poorest of people were involved in this sector, which deteriorated as and when the reforms or revolutions moved on. Government started to implement various reforms, but still agriculture was ignored. Now, who were most involved in agriculture? People who were uneducated, who were illiterate. They were all the agriculturists, the farmers. They lost their lands, they sold their lands, they just everything went away and they were left with nothing. They became poor. So this is how our country has reached to the level where highest poverty level is prevailing in all the large states. So the next point is the methodology followed to estimate poverty line and the number of poor are manipulated. Lot of manipulation happen even today. You know what is manipulation? Too much of they keep changing the figures here and there. So the poverty line, what is the duty of the poverty line? It describes who's poor and who's non-poor by the people's income. So the number of poor is again manipulated because they don't know how to identify. The method that they introduced was not apt to find out the poor or number of poor people in our country. The incidence of poverty has declined over the years, especially in 80s, but poverty still remains a considerable problem. So one needs to understand the poverty level, it didn't vanish, it still prevailed and it's still existing. So a country can be called as a developed country only when its poverty level is zero, or at least to an extent reduced. But India's poverty level has never reduced. Even today, we are poor. The reason being the lack of or the ignorance of various growth places. People, the poor has to be concentrated, which they are not being concentrated. So these are the factors that is influencing the poverty level to increase. So the next slide we'll move on to is the number of poor in India. How do you identify the number of poor in India? When the number of poor is estimated as the proportion of people below the poverty line, it is known as head count ratio. Okay, as you all know how to identify poor and non-poor. If the income is below the poverty line, they are called as poor, and that is how the poverty line describes the proportion of poor people, and it is known as head count ratio. Now, what do you understand by head count? How do you calculate it? Head count ratio is calculated by dividing the number of people below poverty line by the total population. Alright? So, with this, it is estimated on the basis of data collected by the National Sample Survey Organization. So, this is another organization which helps us to collect the data of number of poor people in India. So how do they collect? That is a different calculation. Alright. So just remember, NSSO is nothing but National Sample Survey Organization, which helps in estimating the number of poor people or the data. It helps in collection of data of number of poor people existing in our country. Okay. Now girls, in this slide you can just have a look at the number and percentage of population below poverty line. So as per the year, you can see the first column, it's about year. From 1973 to 74, you can see percentage of population below poverty line is 54.9%. Imagine most half of the population were below the poverty line. Then poverty line, total population below poverty line amongst rural and urban. Then percentage of India's poor located in rural and urban. You can just have a look at this. It is for your information. Okay. With this, you can see, compare the year 1973 to 2004. You can see there is a drastic change. The percentage of population below poverty line has come to a reduction from 54.9% to 21.8%. And also the percentage of India's poor located is also reduced in rural areas, but urban areas it prevails the same. With this, we'll move on to the next slide. So this is about the extent of urban rural poverty. So we all know the poverty doesn't just exist in one particular locality, it is all over the country. So what is this trying to tell is, in the year 1973 to 74, there were 81.33% of poor resided in rural areas, which declined to 71.40% in 2004 to 5. So the percentage of poor has been reduced, okay, comparatively from the year 73 to 2004. But in the year 1990, the absolute number of poor in rural areas had declined. You know what do you mean by absolute number of poor, right? So whereas the number of poor in the urban areas, the counterparts increased marginally. So you can understand, one area it started to decline, whereas in other areas the marginally it started to increase. The gap between the absolute number of poor in rural and urban areas did not narrow down until the early 90s. So the gap, it started to build more and more. And you know, being narrow is like, it just kept going, it's just parallel. There was no point where it could meet, and where we could tell, yes, the population's poverty is being reduced. All right. Now we shall see India's largest states, which is being suffering from poverty. So what is the percentage of population which is suffering with below poverty line? Okay. So, states like Orissa, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. So, these were the states they suffered severely and also still suffering. The percentage of population which is below the poverty line according to the year from 1973 to 74, you can see Orissa, what was the percentage? It was 66.18% of poverty level. Then in the year 99 to 2000, it was 47 to 50, 47.15%. Moving on to the year 2004 to 5, it drastically reduced to 39.90%. So you can see there is a slight reduction of poverty, and hopefully in the coming years the poverty will subside and we'll all be in a good position in the economy, right? With this you can just have a look at the different states, what are the different percentage of population that is under the poverty line. Okay, you can see Karnataka. Karnataka is in the year 1973 to 74, it was 54.47%. And in the year 99 to 2000, it reduced half of it, 20.04%. And then in the year 2004, just matter of 4 years, it has really improved, 17.40% of population who were below poverty line. So likewise, you can compare different states and see which state is better. I think Andhra Pradesh has really improved with 48.86 into 1973. In 2004, it is 11.10. So that's a drastic no. It is a super high speed change, which is a good sign of economic development. Alright, so girls will be stopping for today till here. In the next class, we will continue with what causes poverty. Alright, I just want you people to have a thorough check with all the previous topics that we have studied in this chapter, poverty. Any doubts, please get back to me. The notes will be given after the video. Please drop your attendance in the group now after watching video completely. Make sure that you people just don't open the video and don't start sending WhatsApp saying that yes, I'm present. Please, when the class is going on, think that you're sitting right in the class and you're listening to it. All right, so your exams are also coming up, girls, so prepare. And I've given you the portions. Please make sure you are thoroughly prepared, and we have planned for a revision class in the coming next class also. So prepare with the questions that is being given, and also simultaneously please study what is there in the textbook. Don't ignore, don't be dependent only on the questions that is being given by the teacher. Please make sure that you learn this economics for your subject knowledge, not for scoring marks. Please make sure, keep this in mind, and work hard. All right, girls? Fine. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.